Something I've noticed as I've been playing Slosher is that at times it feels like it's great at painting, and then at other times it feels like its paint is really weak. Being forced to play Turf War instead of ranked modes against my will this weekend has helped me realize at least part of why it feels that way, and I want to share what I figured out. There's a concept in math called tessellation, which I promise is way simpler than the name makes it sound. A shape or pattern of shapes is said to tessellate if it can cover an area without overlapping or leaving any gaps. For example, squares set side by side tessellate, so you can cover an area completely with them, like floor tiles. But you can't do the same with regular pentagons. There's no way to put them together that they won't have these annoying gaps. That's why we make chessboards out of squares, or Settlers of Catan boards out of hexagons, but people generally don't try to make game boards with spaces that are pentagon-shaped. What I've realized that's super cool about the ink from a shooter, say my main, the splatter shot, is that the ink is essentially a rectangle if you paint in a line, and rectangles tessellate. If you put one line down and then put another line next to it, you can avoid painting something you've already painted before, and also avoid leaving gaps that will cost you shots to fill in later. It's a really efficient painting pattern. Now yes, there are other advantages to shooters' painting patterns besides just this. Because a shot is so fast, you can fire for a really short amount of time if all you need to do is fill one little annoying gap. You don't have to fire an entire blaster shot or fling another slosh at that. You may also want to paint like this, creating this cone instead, especially if you're trying to spam paint for special charge faster. But to the point of the video, if you need to paint an area for the sake of moving through it, this is your go-to option. And it's because you can paint so thoroughly, that is, with so few gaps, so quickly, with so little ink wasted on overlapping friendly paint that was already on the ground. Compare that to the Slosher's paint. That's still a solid line, swimmable, with no gaps in it, that has a pretty similar painting range, though the hitbox for damaging players goes a lot further than the splatter shots. So in that respect, the two weapons are pretty comparable. But the problem is that it doesn't tessellate the way that the splatter shots does. Because it starts narrower and then widens at the edge, you're forced to either waste some of the ink at the edge to keep the narrower parts from forming gaps between them, or you're forced to leave gaps to spread them out more that you'll have to go back and maybe fill in later. What I've noticed, and this is a somewhat common phenomenon for frontline weapons, is that the matches where the Slosher plays extra aggressive are usually the ones where it tends to paint the most, and that's because it's attacking enemy positions that are more likely to be painted the enemy color. And therefore, they're less likely to drop ink on spots that are already painted the friendly color. The Slosher in particular sees this effect even more, because the part of the slosh that paints the most is the one the furthest away from the Slosher. That's the one that's most likely to be aimed onto the enemy side toward more enemy ink. Turf War requires that players spend at least some amount of time painting their base very thoroughly. But time spent painting the base is time spent not controlling space in mid. So it's something you want to figure out a plan for and optimize, if not for the sake of tryharding to win the game, then at least so that you can get the job done and start playing the game sooner. When it fell to me to paint the base as the Slosher, I realized I didn't have a good idea of how to paint specific areas thoroughly. And so I stepped into the lobby to try and figure out better painting patterns to use. There are some ways to make the Slosher's painting pattern more consistent and swimmable that I'm going to try incorporating when I can. But I think the overall takeaway here is that the Slosher just isn't made to be a paint support. An NZAP can sit back in their base and crank out Tacticooler charge really efficiently on whatever level geometry the game gave it to paint. A Slosher, though, is better suited to aggressing enemy positions, and will be rewarded for doing so with more special charge than if it tried to stay back and fit its non-tessellating sloshes together to thoroughly cover the ground.